So before starting the video, I would like to notify to you that this paper was actually once reviewed by another machine learning paper reviewer called Yannick Kilcher, and I watched his videos in the process of trying to understand this paper by myself, and the video was really great and his explanations were excellent, so it really helped me in the process of trying to understand this paper myself, trying to explain it to myself, and trying to put this all together in this video format. So this my explanation process might have some similarities or some overlapping parts or like similarities with his explanation. So I would like to just put that as a disclaimer. So yeah, I highly suggest you to watch this video. Now I'll try to explain this paper called "A Bio-Inspired Bistable Recurrent Cell Allows for Long-Lasting Memory." So this paper suggests a new form of recurrent cell that allows each individual cells to have a memory using a property of biological neurons called bistability. And this paper suggests that equipping this bistability recurrent cell called BRC with another property called neuromodulation makes it similar to GRU cells, making GRUs closer to biologically plausible neuron cells. And they also empirically show that their new form of recurrent cells outperform RNNs, GRUs, or LSTMs in tasks that require very long-lasting memories. Now let's actually look at the paper. So how do RNNs work? So basically RNNs, or recurrent neural networks, are networks that specialize in receiving sequence data like audio waves or text input or stock data or stock market data. And these kind of data are what goes through in a recurrent neural network. Each is step by step. So what I mean by that is when you have x0, x1, x2, x3, and so on, the recurrent neural network RNN starts by a initial hidden let's just erase this x0. It starts by an initial hidden step h0, where both x1 and h0 goes through a recurrent cell and produces a next hidden state h1. And by going through the same cell, same weight in the next time step with h1 and x2 as the input, it produces h2, the next hidden state. And also by combining this and this, it produces the next hidden state, and so on. So by this formulation, this RNNs can learn step by step or sequence in the data. But this has a problem because in this kind of RNNs, they have a problem of vanishing gradients or exploding gradients. So when you see this equation of basic RNN, you can see that the xt and ht minus 1 is multiplied or dot producted by this weight matrix u or w. And you know that when these weight matrices has a value smaller than 1, then when you keep multiplying this w step by step, then the values slowly decay to 0. And when the values are bigger than 1, then they explode exponentially. So this is a problem in traditional RNNs, which new types of recurrent cells like GRUs or LSTMs kind of help solve by applying a gated unit. But all these GRUs or LSTMs or RNNs have a similar problem because their only source of memory is achieved through this global state of the network where the hidden state is getting updated every step by step. So you can think this RNNs as having a memory throughout the entire step of the network. Now this is a problem because this is a problem because it's hard to optimize, and it's vulnerable to exploding or vanishing gradients. So what biological neurons, or what neurons actually in our brains does, is instead of having these memories at the entire network level, it has these memories at individual cell levels. And this is possible because each neuron type can switch between several different firing patterns like spiking, bursting, or bistability. And in this paper, we'll be looking at bistability especially. Now, this mitigates the burden at the network level, which should make training these RNNs much easier. So this paper proposes a new sort of biologically motivated recurrent cell called bistable recurrent cell, or BRC, and they also suggest another variant of it by introducing yet another biological property of neurons called neuromodulation, and make a recurrent cell called NBRC, or neuromodulated bistable recurrent cell. And through empirical studies, they show that both BRC and NBRC can produce better results and just outperforms GRUs or LSTMs in tasks that require very long-term memorizations. Now let's look at how these actually work. So let's actually look at the mathematical formulation of RNNs and GRUs. So this paper looks at GRUs especially because GRUs are a bit more simpler than our LSTMs. Now GRUs, just like any recurrent cells, receives a hidden state h from previous time step t minus 1 and the current input xt, and combines them to produce a next hidden state ht. Now this ht, what differs between GRUs or LSTMs or RNNs is how this intermediate process happens. So let's look at how it happens in GRUs. So you can see that this, just like the traditional RNNs, this x and h are each multiplied by a weight matrix and added up and goes through a nonlinearity sigmoid function, which produces zt. And because it goes through sigmoid, it would have a value between 0 and 1 in ZT at least. And in RT, it does the same thing with different weight matrices and produces RT, which has a value of 0 to 1. Now you might wonder why these are necessary. Now this line is the step where the actual hidden state update happens. So you can see that you can decompose this equation into two parts, this part and this part. And you can see that zt or 1 minus zt is multiplied in each of these terms. So what this means is that zt, since this is a value between 0 and 1, acts as sort of a switch, where since this is a Hadamard product or element-wise product, when zt is a value close to 0, this term will be ignored. And this term, since it's multiplied by 1, will be more emphasized. And instead, when zt is closer to 1, then this term will be emphasized, and since this is 0, this will be de-emphasized. Now let's look at what it actually emphasizes or de-emphasizes. First, ht minus 1. And second, this new equation, which is similar to the traditional RNN equation. So what this basically says is that zt is a switch that determines how much of the previous hidden state we want to retain and how much of the new hidden state calculated we want to insert. So zt is just basically combining the previous hidden state and the new hidden state, which is calculated through this equation, and sort of acting as a gate that makes the network forget certain things or remember certain things. So that was the zt, and now let's look at the actual this actual tanh part. And you can see that this is also the same with traditional RNN. You multiply xt by weight matrix, you multiply ht minus 1 by weight matrix, but one difference is that you perform a element-wise product with RT, which is also a value between 0 and 1. So this can be interpreted as, since you're combining xt and ht minus 1, RT determines how much of the previous hidden state you really want to combine with the current input. So you have this current input, and this RT determines how much of the previous hidden state HT minus 1 you want to pick and combine with XT to produce this output, and goes through nonlinearity like hyperbolic tangent. And this is our new sort of hidden state, which goes through the same equation like this. Yeah, so basically, looking at this again, ZT determines how much do we want to forget from the previous hidden state or remember, and RT determines how much of the previous hidden state we want to combine with the current input. I hope this makes sense. And that's how you calculate this HT, this new hidden state, for GRUs. It's basically this. So GRUs outperform RNNs in almost every tasks. And now let's look at bistability. Now this is the part where I had the most trouble trying to understand because I'm not really familiar with biological neurons. So bistability is a trait of biological neurons where, depending on the previous input, it can produce two stable states instead of one. So by formulating this into a diagram, so let's say an example. So in this RNN example, you receive hidden states, hidden states, hidden states, hidden states, and this, by introducing this bistability, depending on this hidden state, it can produce a stable output of only two kinds, either this or that, depending on the previous input. So this is important because this sort of stable location where it's either one value or another value can be considered or can be interpreted as a cellular memory. So each individual cell has two types of memories. So by introducing this bistability, we can add memory into individual cell units. Now let's look at how this actually happens. So this is a control diagram of a neuron in a single time scale. And through the synapses, you can see that this neuron receives signals from other neurons, vpre1, vpre2, vpre3, and combines these signals and passes it through a nonlinearity f, just like just any other recurrent neural network, and produces a output signal of I sin. And what this does is it goes through and is divided by this 1 over CS and then added up. So this is a vector or a matrix, and this is added up to produce this V post. Now what's important is that traditional RNNs should have ended here, but what this biological neuron does is that its output modulates its own intermediate process. So this V post goes through a nonlinearity F and is subtracted in this intermediate point from I sin to produce IM. So this is a pretty cool property because the network can modulate, the individual cells can modulate themselves. So how is this related to bistability? And that's where this F, this part here, F, comes in place. And F is a nonlinearity like this. So you have this F V post, which is equal to I int. And this is basically input minus alpha times the hyperbolic tangent input. So you can see that this is a sort of an activation function that determines on this parameter alpha. Now this activation function has a really interesting property because when alpha is between the value of 0 and 1, it is monotonic. So it just increases like this. But when the value is bigger than 1, like 1.5, then it has these sort of a wave shape where there are technically 3 points that match as 0. And now I'll explain why this is important in bistability. So let's say that, right, let me erase this. Let's say that I sin has a really large value, wait, before saying that, let's say that alpha is a fixed value of 0.5 for now, which is the activation function here, and let's say that I sin has is a very big matrix. So IM will also be a very big matrix, and V post will, because we're adding it up, will be a very big matrix. And since f is a monotonic function because alpha is 0.5, this will also be a very big value. But what's important is that since the output of the neuron modulates itself by subtracting it, the signals aren't big anymore. It's actually getting smaller, a bit smaller. So this will produce since this is summing up, this will produce a bit smaller output. And f will also produce a smaller output, making it small, and you just repeat this and stabilize at the point 0. And now this is important because you can see that since this is a monotonic function, when the input or v post gets getting bigger, I int also produces a big value. So you get down, 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 and reaches a optimal point of 0 because in the opposite direction, where I sin is a very, very small value, like negative value, this will be small, you're adding them up, so this is v post is also small, and this goes through f v post, and you're subtracting it, so it basically increases the value, and reaches a stable point of 0. So this is why this function is kind of interesting, because no matter where you are, depending on this slope, it follows the slope and reaches a stable point of 0 here. So that was the property when alpha was 0.5. But this isn't what we're really interested in the bistability part, because what bistability means is that depending on the input, it can have 2 stable output points. So since this produces a single stable output point, it can't really serve as a memory in the cell. However, what gets really interesting is when alpha is bigger than 1. Then you have these 2 stable points where a input value of v post around here would follow the slope and reach a stable point of 0. And of course, the values here would follow the slope and reach a stable point of 0 at this position. And but what's interesting is that when the v post input is here, it follows the slope and reaches a different stable point here. And same with here, it reaches a different stable point. So what this means is that even though in this, using this activation function of alpha equals 1.5, the neurons, the values of v post, no matter where they are, will eventually make the network reach a stable point of 0 in 2 different locations. Yeah, 2 different locations, and this is colored empty because this is a false stable point, or this is a very unstable point where any value at this exact point will remain stable here, but a value slightly different from this value will shift the value to the closest stable point. So basically, this function has 2 stable points, therefore it can serve as a memory in the network. I think this is a really interesting concept, because by altering this value alpha, you can determine whether this network is bistable or not, which is similar to how biological neurons work, because they can work dynamically by choosing the type of firing patterns they make. Because this is the property of how actual biological neurons perform bistability, let's try to the authors try to put this into recurrent neural networks. So this is the new kind of recurrent neural network they came up with. Now let's look into this at detail. So first we have this CT, which is just wait. So CT, which is just yet another xt and ht minus 1 multiplied by the weight matrix, and goes through a sigmoid and produces a value between 0 and 1. And I'll explain why this is the Hadamard product in a second. Let's just ignore that for now. So CT will produce a value of 0.1, and you can see CT and 1 minus CT. So yeah, so this CT is basically the same with what was ZT in the GRU. So this determines how much of the previous input state we want to remember or forget. Now let's look at AT. So AT is a function of 1 plus tan h and xt multiplied by weight matrix and previous input state multiplied by weight matrix. So yeah, this is also a value that produces, so tan h produces a value between -1 to 1. So by adding 1, this alpha t produces a value between 0, between 0 to 2. Now this is important because we saw that in this equation, in this function, having a value of alpha between 0 and 1 makes it not bistable, but having a value bigger than 1 or smaller than 2 makes it bistable. So basically, alpha or A here isn't a fixed value in BRCs. They can be dynamically modified based on the input and the previous hidden state, which is exactly what biological neurons do. So yeah, you have this AT, and you can see that this is also similar with the GRU part, where xt is multiplied by weight matrix and ht minus 1 is multiplied by not a weight matrix here, but alpha t instead, which has a value of 0 to 2. And this makes and because alpha t is multiplied at this process of calculating this new hidden state, this enforces bistability. And you might, and yeah, so yeah, basically when you read this line, the feedback parameter alpha t, AT is allowed to take a value between 0 to 2. So this allows the cells to switch between monostability, that was the word, when alpha is smaller than 1, and bistability when alpha is bigger than 1. And you might say, oh, well, I don't see this function here in this equation. Well, they provide a proof for this at Appendix A, and I won't go into detail on the proof right now. So just know that by introducing this A parameter here, which is modulated based on x and h, it can dynamically choose between monostability and bistability. So this was the BRC, and now I'll explain why they used Hadamard product instead of dot product in H, and only in updating H here. The reason is because in biological neurons, let's say that these individual neurons are here. In individual neurons, they do interact with each other. Like they they produce outputs, and they are combined in another cells, and they produce output, and so on and so on. But in terms of bistability, the other neuron cells don't usually affect one another. They are all based on the modulations of themselves, which is exactly how it was drawn in this diagram. So this bistability process shouldn't be affected by other fellow neurons. It should be only affected by the states of itself. Therefore, The product of dot product is because when you perform dot product, you essentially multiply between all the different neurons like this, and this is not what biological neurons do. So instead, by doing a Hadamard product or element-wise product, you don't introduce the information of other neurons into individual neurons. Therefore, it is more biologically plausible, is what the authors are explaining. So by these, so by what these individual neurons mean in terms of RNN is basically the hidden state. Since hidden state is a matrix, you can consider each of these elements in the matrix as individual cells, in analogy with biological neurons. So that is the reason why they used Hadamard product instead of dot product. But but in the results later, they show that it didn't really perform as well as LSTMs or GRUs. No, I mean, at least it just didn't perform very well when using Hadamard product instead of using dot product. So, so even though they suggested to use the Hadamard product, they switched it back again to dot product later. Wait, so to clarify, the version that uses the Hadamard product is the BRC, and the one that uses dot product like this is called NBRC. So it's basically from RNN, the authors wanted to introduce bistability, so they switched to Hadamard product, but they saw it didn't perform very well, so they just switched it back to dot product and made NBRC. But this NBRC isn't just a way to increase the performance of network by getting rid of biologically plausibleness. The NBRC is actually kind of biologically plausible, or at least that is what the authors are suggesting, because in bistability there is a trait called neuromodulations, and there's a reason why I said these neurons rarely interact with each other in terms of bistability. Sometimes the neurons do interact with each other or influence each other in the bistability process via a process called neuromodulation. So basically, by just switching the Hadamard product into the normal dot product, you get neuromodulated BRC or NBRC. Yeah, that's the only difference between NBRC and BRC, and NBRCs tend to perform better than BRCs. Now let's look at how they perform by empirical study. So the first benchmark they made is the copy first input benchmark, where the network is presented with a one-dimensional time series of t time steps, where the individual values are sampled from a normal distribution, so have values like this. And after receiving the final xt, final value xt, the network will have to produce a value that approximates x0. So basically, throughout this time steps, the network should learn to remember the original input and forget the inputs at the later steps. And this is hard. This should be hard for LSTMs and GRUs, because since they don't really have that good of a memory, they are highly influenced by the ones at latter portion of the network. So let's see the result. So when the t, or the length of the sequence, is small, like 5 or 50, GRUs and LSTMs slightly outperform BRC or NBRC, but a BRC and NBRC or GRU or LSTM do perform pretty well on small time steps. But when you see that the time step increases, then GRUs and LSTMs start to fail, and when the time step's like 600, it totally fails. But in BRC, and especially NBRC, you can see that the mean squared error losses are very small even at a very large time step. So you can see that this empirically shows how BRCs or NBRCs have these better form of memory by having memories in individual cells compared to GRUs or LSTMs. So the next benchmark is called denoising benchmark. And the difference between this and the copy first input benchmark is that the copy first input benchmark is one-dimensional in its input, so it can't really show the dependence between multiple values in a higher dimensional input as its value as its input. So what denoising benchmark does is that throughout the t time steps, it randomly samples 5 points. And since each inputs are two-dimensional, at the first index, it puts a value of 0 in the chosen places. And in the other places, it puts a value of -1. And at the very end, it puts a value of 1 just to indicate that the array or just that the sequence has ended. And at the second element, it samples a random value. Then what the network should predict is that what are the random values at these 5 regions where it's randomly selected. So this needs to show the interdependence between index 0 and index 1 to make sure that the network predicts these 5 values well. So let's look at the performance. Oh, and by the way, this n term is n term determines how much of this state do we want to set this as -1. So basically, if the n is 200, then 200 inputs from the last part can't be selected as the random 5 different time steps. So this is just to make the task harder, because the network will now have to learn to ignore these most recent time steps and only focus on the early time steps, which is hard for GRUs or LSTMs to do. So basically, bigger n means harder problem and requires more memory. So looking at the performance, when n is small, GRUs and LSTMs perform pretty well, and so does BRC and NBRC. But when n is bigger, BRCs and NBRCs significantly outperform GRUs and LSTMs. And the last one they perform is sequential MNIST, 32 by 32 images, or 1024 pixels. So it needs to learn to classify digits based on a sequence length of 1024. And to also make the task more challenging, just like the denoising benchmark, it zeroed out or just removed the pixels at the end of the time steps to add a forgetting period to make the task more challenging. Now, when we look at this table, we can see that when the n black is small like 0, all the networks perform pretty similar. But when n black is bigger, which means a harder challenge, then BRCs just outperform GRU or LSTM. And GRUs actually perform just like random guessing. So this shows that BRCs and NBRCs have significantly good at retaining long-term memories. So that was an empirical study of BRCs outperforming traditional networks on tasks that require long-term memory. Now, next, the authors did an analysis on the BRC dynamic behavior. So on the task of denoising benchmark, where the network has to memorize the values at these timestamps, they visualized the proportion of bistable neurons where the value of A was bigger than 1, and they also visualized the average value of C. And what they mean by layer here is basically in recurrent cells, you can stack multiple cells together to create a stacked RNN or multi-layer RNN. So that's what they did. They just stacked BRCs together to make the network more deep, and they visualized these values for each of the layers. Now let's focus on the layer 3 now, because it shows the most impact on the bistable neurons, where at each of the timestamp where the network has to memorize, you can see that the proportion of bistable neurons increase. So this shows that bistable neurons do play an important role in making the network retain more information. And for the average value of CT, you can see that similar with the proportion, the CT value also increases step by step. Now to go back to the equation, you can see that CT, having a high value of CT means that you want to retain or memorize more information from the previous step. Therefore, this value of CT increasing every these timestamps means that since your timestamp is increasing, you want to make sure that you memorize the information from the previous timestamps more and more and more. So that's why you want to retain more of the previous hidden states. So these two figures really show the effect of the bistable neurons, or the CT, like how these parameters play a role in making BRCs work in tasks that require long-term memory. So overall, I think this was a really interesting paper that tried to minimize the distance between biological neurons and artificial neuron modules. And it was really interesting to see that how properties from biological brains or biological neurons can be applied to actual artificial neurons to increase their performance in long-term memory. So I think this line of research of trying to apply biological features into artificial modules are really interesting. And even though GRUs and LSTMs still kind of outperform BRCs in tasks that doesn't require very long-term memory, I think BRCs, this line of paper, just a few papers down the line, would improve this BRC a lot more, and hopefully outperform GRUs and LSTMs in all kind of tasks. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. And if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please leave them in the comment section below. Thank you.